adoption and the private sector with the two very fantastic guests that you have, actually three very fantastic guests that you have for this session. Andy Boyd is a former director of the Center for Cyber Intelligence at the CIA. Colonel Candice Frost is now retired, and she is a former director of the Joint Intelligence Operations Center at Cyber Command. So you're getting a fantastic sort of CIA, NSA look at this. And John Carlin is the lawyer who keeps everyone in place. He is the cybersecurity chair at Paul Weiss now, but he's also the former acting deputy attorney general at the Justice Department. So I'm very pleased to turn the conversation over to you, Matt, to expertly moderate. Thank you so much. It's nice to see everyone here.
All right, I was just checking to see if we have got Candice and John able to jump on camera.
I think they might need a minute. I'm kind of looking in the green room here real quick. There we go, John, and I'm sure Candice will be chiming in if you guys want to go ahead and kick off.
All right.
Nice. Thanks for being here, guys.
So the conversation usually starts with there's all this threat, there's all this adversarial action, and usually it's in the backyard of infrastructure that's owned and operated by U.S. industry. And a lot of the time, those adversaries have challenges with our government institutes campaigns to push them out and to keep them at bay. But that's usually done in the international space. When they're on our domestic space that's controlled by corporations, there's this question that comes up of, you know, I own this cloud environment. There are bad actors on it. What can I do to get them off of my infrastructure? What can I do to push back or extend the perimeter of defenses to where bad actors really don't have a home in my environments, my systems, my services? And how far can I do that? And what tools can the government help me with necessarily to do that action or to approve that action, but to kind of point me in the right direction to say, these are bad actors, these are these groups, you're right, they don't need to be there. And so this problem has been an ongoing discussion. It usually ends with anything that is offensive cyber is the direct business of the US government, and because you don't want a conflict zone where people are misinterpreting US actions for US industry. But at the same time, there are things that industry can do. So I'll go ahead and start with you, Andy, and let you get your thoughts on some of this, and we'll take that conversation from there.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Suzanne, for having me. And I'm very comforted by having John Carlin here to, again, keep us within the left and the right limits of the law. This is an academic discussion of sorts, but obviously policy and legal ramifications of what my former general counsel, when I was in the agency, would call inherently government activity. And a lot of what we do, as you alluded to, Matt, in an offensive C&E space is inherently government activity, but it doesn't have to be that way permanently in my mind. First, I'll address, how we prioritize countering nation state and non-nation state cyber threats as it relates to the rest of our national security priorities. And I frequently, I spent the bulk of my career in the counterterrorism world, and so I frequently use, connect the history of that to where we are in cyberspace. I mean, immediately post 9/11, it took a while for us as a government to get a unified approach to how we were going to counter foreign terrorist threats, be it Al Qaeda, be it ISIS, you name it, and how we were going to secure the homeland domestically, and what agencies were going to do what. I mean, over the course of the past 2 decades, I think we've done a very good job at that. FBI has a role domestically, and in some cases internationally, with our various law enforcement partners. Obviously, CIA dominates the intelligence space and our liaison relationships on counterterrorism, and on and on and on, supporting our military posture. And again, using a metaphor from the counterterrorism world, trying to find intelligence collection, fix the farther down the field on intelligence collection, and then finish whatever that finish option is. In counterterrorism, it's frequently military action, but it can also be law enforcement action. And so what I do think we have to consider in cyberspace is applying not exactly the same finish options as in counterterrorism, but the same idea and the same prioritization that we had done for counterterrorism, applying it to cyber threats. coming from my role as the former director of the Center for Cyber Intelligence at CIA, I don't think we really prioritized it above some of the other intelligence priorities that we had in CIA, and I think that can be extended across the government. But I want to focus just briefly on non-state actors, ransomware actors. I mean, I think that is an existential threat to our economy. Change Healthcare, United Healthcare, one of the more significant ransomware attacks in recent months, has to date cost United Healthcare $1.6 billion. And you extend that across the numerous ransomware, and then a $22 million ransomware to the actors associated with that. So you multiply that across the range of our economy, the healthcare sector, the education sector, the rest of our various critical infrastructure sectors, and that is a major threat to the economy. And we have an array of tools within the U.S. government. Back to Montgomery's point, some of those tools we're not allowed to use domestically. I think as a policy community, we need to reconsider that because the existential threat, frankly, is not from Al-Qaeda anymore. It's from nation state actors, the PRC in Russia principally, but also these non-state actors that are arrayed across the globe and are frequently tied to state actors, either a dotted line relationship with the Russian security services or whatnot. That's the US government side. Matt, as you point out, the private sector owns most of the infrastructure. From the nation state side, the PRC utilizes US data centers to pre-position tools. We're all very familiar with the Volt Typhoon situation, pre-positioning tools. The only way that we're going to counter that threat is if we as a national security establishment engage the private sector. And Rob, I think Rob's on this call, I hope. Rob Joyce did an extraordinary effort at CSD. I think, frankly, they've been in the lead as far as engaging the private sector, but again, their mandate is just within the defense industrial base. We have to cover the rest of the private sector, and frankly, give the taxpayer what they need and defend the country from cyber threats. I think the American people expect no less. So I've been speaking for quite a while. I'm going to pause, Matt, if you have a follow-up question, or again, if John wants to weigh in and tell me every thought that I just expressed is illegal.
We'll wait on John, and we'll jump to Candice real quick, just from her perspective, and then we'll get John to clean up on aisle 9 as necessary and get his thoughts. Candice, will you jump in?
Hi, thanks, and I appreciate it. I have the unique perspective of having seen it both from the military side and what was conducted at Cyber Command and intertwined with NSA at the time, and still to what I see now in the private sector and supporting the DIB. And I would say, Andrew, brilliant points on so many regards, but I think the hardest part we've started to see is that who is feeding the consortium of whether it's the Department of Defense or feeding those intel communities, and where does that information come from? And unfortunately, we just don't have enough data right now that's fed, because so much of it is in the private sector, to be able to go after some of these threats. And so that's been the biggest concern on my mind. We have seen law enforcement lean in. FBI, the director, has spoken multiple times to the need of a growing consortium of people steeped in the ability to find bad actors, both domestic and overseas, that are in our networks. But we just don't have enough people right now trained, equipped, and ready on the personnel side to be able to take on this massive problem that we face.
All right, John. And so in addition to making sure we didn't muddy up the waters on the way we're defining some of these, what is your take on where we see some of the ways we could leverage industry?
The full employment task of keeping Mr. Boyd out of legal trouble. No, but thanks for having me today. And I guess top line, because I think we're hitting a couple different buckets that implicate different legal policy regimes. So as Andrew said, one would be where could the government better prioritize taking action? Should the government be taking more aggressive action in this space overseas using the full suite of Title 10, so defense, military authorities, Title 50, intelligence community authorities, Title 18, law enforcement authorities, to combat this threat, similar to the all tools approach that we used countering the terrorists. threats where there'd be real discussion around the National Security Council table, an agreed strategic plan, and then joint ops trying to use, as best you could, authorities relatively seamlessly by having, depending on which legal authority you needed to use, you could see which government agency would be in charge, and agree that right now we're not applying at speed and scale that approach to the cyber threat. And so I think one question is, and there's a legitimate debate about this. I think there are some who think that with all of the threats that we're facing right now, nation state threats, Russian aggression, situation in the Middle East, China's rise, that we shouldn't be spending resources from the intelligence community when it comes to ransomware. I agree with this group that is a mistake, and that we should be continuing to prioritize and lift it up the priority framework, because there's both the point Andrew raised on the damages, the real and present damage is causing now to companies across the United States, and it's a drag on our economy. But then it is also, we're essentially training and feeding the research and development of criminal groups that get used by nation state actors. And so it's like developing the most vicious pathogen that you can, and we're creating the ideal circumstances for it to keep learning how to attack us, to attack our organism. So that's on the government side. On the what can a private sector, then I'd kind of divvy it into two buckets. So one would be to Frost's point, which would be, we need resources. So I think this is an area where for contractors who would be acting under ultimately government authority to provide those additional resources against this threat, that it's an area where we continue to see need for contractor support to be able to take actions abroad using government authority. For private companies under their own authority, Matt, and I think you raised this earlier, there is that divide between creative things that you can do on your own network, which I still think are underutilized with expertise. And that's an area where there has been guidance put out by Justice Department, but it's also where, depending on your sector, you can work actively with government agencies. If you're having legal concerns, it's one you probably want to consult with your lawyers on. But being creative within your environment to do things like deliberately create, it's crazy these days. You can't keep a dedicated adversary out, so probably don't put your crown jewels in a folder called crown jewels. But that doesn't mean you get rid of that folder. It does mean that you actively monitor it, and then if you see activity, you might not want to disrupt it immediately, even though that there's risk. And that's something you can work out ahead of time. And you may want to feed it, depending on your sector, with government support, information that is not true. To make it more difficult for the adversary to attack you. Where it gets more fraught, and I'll turn it back to you in case others want to weigh in, would be the idea of a private company taking action outside of its network, which currently under US law, I think raises significant both criminal and civil concerns right now, so it would require a change.
And so throwing this back at you, Andy, so where do we see momentum that we can pick up on to try and get this ball rolling? Like, where is the current speed bumps to improving either that expand past your infrastructure or increasing the capability for industry within their own infrastructure to do something about this problem?
I think the very fact that we're having this discussion is indicative that this is being discussed in certain policy circles, and the folks that are on this call are integral to that discussion. Everybody who's on camera right now, but Mark Montgomery, Rob Joyce, the whole crew. I think there's two separate things. There's a number of private sector companies in the United States and with our allies who have offensive C&E capabilities, are either on contract with the government doing vulnerability research or exploit development and the like. They could be enlisted, so to speak, under U.S. government authorities, under Cyber Command or under Title 50 authorities to be a deeper part of that equation. I think, unless John corrects me, I think that is not a legal issue per se. That is just getting a policy green light. And I see John nodding, so I think we're good on that one. I do think because, we're having this discussion, which is reflective of discussions I've either been tangentially part of or directly part of when I was still in the government with folks in policy circles, both on the legislative side and the executive side. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think there's an appetite to just sort of carte blanche give both DoD and the intel community the thumbs up to pursue this. But I started as director of CCI in January 2020. We're certainly a long way down the path, or much farther down the path than we were back then. And that's on the offensive side, sort of, both dismantling the threat, the foreign threat, and whatnot, but also utilizing private sector entities to collect intelligence about ransomware threats and whatnot. On the defensive side, I do think that's a completely different, part of this discussion, but a different equation. And to John's point, which again, I understand it a bit less, obviously, but companies, would be breaking the law if they were sort of hunting, doing their own hunt forward operations outside of their own corporate networks. But we do have to have the discussion as to how we can help these companies, especially, the hyperscalers. They're going to have the capabilities to deal with a lot of this. But what we're really talking about is the small companies, infrastructure providers, or even in the context of what Rob Joyce dealt with within the defense industrial base, these tiny little companies that make a widget that's directly, that the F-35 or whatever can't operate without, but they don't have the wherewithal to defend their networks to a degree that's required against the Chinas and the Russias of the world. We have to have a deeper discussion about that. And I don't necessarily think it's amending the law, but it is like hearing these companies out as to what they need from the federal government. And I will pause.
Yeah, and Candice, on the prioritization side, there's like you mentioned, there's only so many actors on both sides, both industry and government, to execute on these ideas. Is there some way that industry can start to spin up now to be ready? Like the challenge is, okay, say tomorrow, everybody green lights from a policy direction. How should we be running in pace with the government on these ideas so that industry is ready to participate when this happens, so there isn't another 2-year jam of getting people in the right place to do the right thing when this happens?
So I think the difference in I know we started the conversation with the comparison to potentially what happened after 9/11. The difference is there's a lot of industry participation right now. What the stall is the valley of death and the DoD side on the government's perspective of getting these individuals, with whether they're hyper skilled individuals or getting organizations onto contract. And we have seen it over and over. Cyber Command is a great example. In 2024, they were given very specific authorities to really increase their ability to purchase. Their budget was also increased, but then you look at their contracting personnel, and unfortunately they're just that they weren't accelerated in that level as well. So I think you've got across the spectrum, go to any black hat, go to any conference, we've got enough talent in America in some regards, in some respects right now, but just not necessarily growing the bench within the government, and also the speed and scale at which they would have to add. So increasing the throughput would be one big point, but also, helping the ability for these efforts to get enacted would be another aspect of where the government has got to really accelerate change.
And John, we're not talking about creating a US-based NSO group, but at some point we are asking for people to get better at looking at exploits and looking at things in a way that's not traditionally that warm and fuzzy area for creating tools. Do you see anything from your perspective where the government can leverage something to kind of tee up some more of these innovations just on the R&D side? That seems like a challenge where you start, like, how do you even test these types of tools before you get into these types of relationships?
That's a good, well, first, I think we're in the midst of a change in approach, and that's a good thing. So there's been some proof of concept now, right? That, and really I'd say this administration deserves credit, post-colonial pipeline of doing this shift where you weren't just, there was a policy approach of bad guy hits company, regulators go after the company. You try to maybe arrest the bad guys, they're in a place that you can't reach them. And then that was the end of the cycle. And what you've seen now, I think, is this look for creative solutions, including tapping the private sector. And it's not an overnight, it's an evolution that's been going on for a decade, but it's where they reached a speed and scale of doing things like joint operations with multilateral partners to disrupt the command and control infrastructure that's held on. Sometimes that's action that your private partners can take because it's within their infrastructure. Sometimes it is things using the resources of multiple agencies and departments, like targeting the wallet that received the extortion proceeds and stealing them back. I think there's room for more creativity around those operations and tracking. I was proud in my pro bono hat to help just get started the first crypto ISAC, which I think is a major development. I hope this group and the expertise here can support it so that within the digital currency space, you start having more attention paid to those using that space to move illicit proceeds. So we're starting to see this push towards what are the most creative ways we can raise the costs essentially for the bad guys, including in space where we're not going to get cooperation from the authorities. And then to your question, I think flowing from that would be, okay, what's the cost, and are there tools that we need to develop to better go after those bad actors? Right now, I'm just curious what Candice and Andrew think, whether it's a lack of tooling on the offensive end, or it's a lack of applying the existing capabilities and tooling to this threat versus others.
John, before I answer that, I'd just like to hit something that Matt said, just to clarify, because I always found myself in this sort of backed into this corner. You mentioned NSO Group. So I would argue that, we have to remember why everybody dislikes NSO Group. They made some colossally bad business decisions by selling their product to people that they shouldn't have sold their product to. There's a whole array of business reasons why they did that, and how many employees they needed to pay, et cetera, et cetera. NSO Group, Candice, Intellexa, and a couple others who are on the commerce sanctions list. That all then led to the executive order on spyware, which was not the greatest name for that executive order, but so be it. And then similar language that was in last year's NDAA, which gives a very clear path for companies. And again, we have to erase the NSO Group name from our memories, but companies with that level of skill, with that level of capability in the vulnerability research arena, because I think that's exactly how we're going to do it. Now, they will have to adhere to the US law. They will have to not, sell to entities that want to behead Jamal Khashoggi and the like. But that kind of technical capability, I think, is on the private sector side, is exactly what we're going to need to succeed. Because I would argue, to John's second point and question, it's not we have plenty of talent in the U.S. government. It's a volume issue. We just have too many intelligence collection objectives. We have too many needs for countering the cyber threat, nation state and non-nation state. We just do not have the resources to do it. And again, Mark Montgomery and I have had this conversation. Do we have the exact talent we need? No, on the Title 10 side, or else we wouldn't be having this discussion about a cyber force and whatnot. But we're good enough. It's really a volume or a demand signal on operations. That's the real issue in my mind. I'll pause.
And Candice, Andy brought up collection. And that is one where I know you have some strong opinions on how to really shape the collection targets. Like, how do we know what we should be collecting against? I turn that to you in this phase.
I think that I'll go quickly to John's point on tooling. I think we do have the capacity and capability. The vulnerability research field right now, there are some really strong players. that have the tools to be able to use this. Again, it's just getting them in the right position within government to be able to execute is a huge part. And then expediting the ability to get them hand in glove on contract with the right thing without 15 layers of bureaucracy is one part. That also ties into the collection side of the house. There is an issue I know with the writing that Mark has done with the NSA and Cyber Command being hand in glove with one another. When one is on the Department of Defense's side and the other is in the intelligence community, even as John mentioned, the different titles and authorities that come with those, not just to pepper in the law enforcement side as well. So each individual is collecting whatever, I guess, inputs or throughputs that most benefit their agency or organization. But the problem with cybersecurity or cyberspace in totality and writ large is that it's just such a wide domain. And without actual sharing at a very rapid rate, the threat is just too fast. So the private sector has done this and done pretty well. But of course, they charge each individual a very hefty fee for being able to use those services. And so many of the government has to go out to both PAI organizations that collect that and do large data swath pulls because they just don't have enough either capability or storage of collection itself. So there's got to be, I know a lot of people don't want to set up another agency, another organization, but there has to be some type of modification because the intel community, specifically NSA, is doing things to support not only itself, but for the entire community, country, and what they are looking for, not necessarily to go after and to exploit. And that's been one of the hardest parts that I've seen, and where I do agree with the separation of NSA and Cyber Command, because right now it's just implausible to have an IC organization leading over a DoD combatant command.
Well, and one of the things we're seeing across the board is there needs to be a strategic deterrence that's very public, or at least something that we can really speak to. And so the harder it is to identify people targeting critical infrastructure on the US domestic side, and the harder it is to get them off those networks, the harder it is to really claim that strategic deterrence territory that we truly need to make that decision-making a harder case. John, in your roles, have you seen that strategic deterrence conversation kind of wade into this waters, where it's not just that we need the capability, it's not just that industry needs to be able to respond, it's that adversaries need to see that we're doing these things so that it impacts their decision making in these areas?
Yeah, and it's funny, we're at the 10-year anniversary, I think, of a change really informed by the idea of strategic deterrence, of taking that which we were all seeing, but was kept on the intel side, so we couldn't talk about it publicly, and making it public. And so you think about 2014, 10 years ago, you had some significant milestone cases. You had Justice was leading National Security Division. We brought the first criminal indictment where we laid out in detail in a speaking indictment, so it was publicly available, what members of the People's Liberation Army Unit 61398 were doing, which is that they were putting on their uniform every morning and attacking private companies for private financial gain. And that was, although it was done obviously through the Justice Department and appropriately brought as a case where we could have proceeded to trial before a jury, it was done after consultations with the National Security Council, because I was indicting members of a military, could have consequences here, and foreign relations consequences. So I know it was with Rick Leggett and Chris Inglis and other folks who were supportive of this idea of, we're to Candice's point, we have this incredible intelligence collection, but we're not operationalizing it, and it's happening at such a scale now, we're not really learning that much about the adversary, other than they steal everything everywhere all the time. And that was the same year that then you have the OPM hack and the very public conversation and agreement between President Obama and President Xi, and the North Korean attack on Sony. So a lot happened 10 years ago, and the North Korean attack on Sony, I think, led for the first executive order of its kind that would allow explicitly allowed the use of sanctions for cyber-related activity. It wasn't needed for North Korea because they had done so many other things. They had their own executive order. But going forward, where people spotted that this needs to be part of our toolkit. So, I mean, one question is kind of where are we now at being public about these disruption efforts? And I think the whole public discussion and testimony by the FBI director about Volt Typhoon reflects that we continue to want to use the microphone, the bully pulpit as part of our policy. I know I was out in Munich this year, and it was quite striking to our partners in Europe the amount of which time the U.S. government officials were spending talking about Volt Typhoon, where they had seen similar operations, but were not it was new to make that public. Turn over to others if they have thoughts on where we should go next with the strategy of being more public about it and our deterrence efforts.
Well, Andy, there's a little bit of language in the White House's cybersecurity strategy that basically is saying use all tools at our disposal to increase the challenges and decision making of adversaries come at us. When it's ransomware, it's a bit of a wrinkle because it's not necessarily the State Department that weighs in when there's actors that aren't claimed by, say, Russia or others. They just are those dotted lines that we kind of hint towards. Do you see an area where there's going to be an opportunity space to be more strategically deterrent in that range where they have those kind of safe harbor actors out there?
So I think we've very recently headed down this path, and I credit FBI Cyber and all of DOJ for Operation Kronos. Now, granted, it was with our British partners and others, but you know, taking I think we call them locks up, but the public sort of discussion about those actors, and I would argue that the public relations campaign, not only shutting down Lockbit, but the whole campaign surrounding that, it does have deterrent value, because if you expose the private information and identity of those ransomware actors, yeah, we can't get to them in St. Petersburg or wherever they are in Russia, but their colleagues, so to speak, in the criminal enterprise are like, oh, wait, that guy owes me money. Now, I'm fairly certain, and John can probably comment on this, that that was a heavy lift for the lawyers at DOJ, because theoretically, you were putting that perpetrator at risk of, you know, getting tuned up by his criminal colleagues or worse. And I obviously wasn't in the room for those discussions, but that had to be a pretty robust discussion before Operation Kronos went down. But I think that's a leading indicator, at least in the ransomware space, of where we're going. To the cyber strategy and deterrence, I did have this discussion frequently in my tenure as director at CCI. People always wanted to use cyber to counter, from a deterrence perspective, cyber attacks. And I always thought that was, not always, I frequently thought that was not the right approach, because we have a whole array of diplomatic and other tools to counter the cyber threat. We have just chosen, again, and I think Michael Daniel just put in that, back in 2014, we publicly just discussed this sort of thing, and we have used those tools at time, but not to at various times, but not to scale. And I think we need to use our diplomatic tools, coercive diplomacy or otherwise, as tools to counter the cyber threat, and not always go through the rigmarole, like what cyber tools do we have on the shelf, so to speak? None, because cyber tools are not kept on the shelf like, artillery shells. Because it's frequently not, cyber on cyber is just not going to achieve the diplomatic or national security goals frequently that we want from a deterrence perspective. And I will pause.
And Candice, just to give you an opportunity to jump in on what Andy was talking about, but also to layer in, we have seen the federal government be pretty public in its responses and in its actions, especially around election security. We saw them breaking up a whole ransomware gangs and things of the like. Can you touch on that? Like how we have had some successes in the bad actor lane that aren't necessarily always state sponsored.
Yeah, and I think it's great that you brought up election security. That's one of my items that are closest to my heart. I would say the name and shame technique sometimes does work, but other times there are so many other actual physical activities going around that it doesn't really make as much of a wave. Really, the Russian invasion into Ukraine is just a really great example of that was a part of the intel community that did a really great job on the information side, getting ahead of the narrative of what Russia was saying. But unfortunately, as artillery shells were lobbed across a free country's border, that takes precedence, and then the things that they started to target. Now, that's not to say that it was a great victory for our involvement in assisting, but also we've been able to see the increase of Russia's use of cybersecurity, or sorry, cyber effects onto Ukraine and even other NATO countries increasingly now that the focus has really focused on the force on force, where they have really learned a lot and gotten better. That's one area. But I think that flipping from an actual heated war into kind of a arena of our national security that is important to everyone, and that's free and fair elections. I think we have seen a great work by CISA to really point and walk the dog of the 2016 election and how information operations truly influence that. Going forward now, how are we starting to see the change in emerging technology and the impacts that it will have on the next election? The great part is our IC is very forward leaning into understanding the threats. But when we look at the next 2024 and the trigger that we'll start to see in either small arenas or all the way to the national elections, I do see deep fakes being the biggest area. So I tell investors, if there's one area that you could really, make a solid dollars being able to understand what's a deep fake and what isn't. Very hard to do. But that's going to be one area that I think political parties are really going to face as you get closer and closer to the wire with respect to how we understand truth in itself and this post-truth modernist world that we're in right now. It's going to be incredibly difficult. And the great part is we have a ton of people that stand at the wall and try and prevent issues from happening. But as John aptly put, it's everything everywhere all at once, and that will hit us for sure in November.
And John, just to give you the opportunity to follow up on that, and also we did have a question come in from Chris Messina, and his element to this was right now part of the engagement with government is a little bit challenging because of the regulatory frameworks for reporting, and that you may have an extra scrutiny from a reporting agency if you go directly to the FBI to talk to them about getting an adversary off your network. Can you touch on that? Like how is the government looking at opening its doors to people that have these adversarial presences that they want to take out or make gone without stepping in it from a regulatory framework?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I guess too, just to circle back to what Andy was saying on strategic deterrence and which tools to use. I very much agree that we should try to strike back where we are strong and our enemy is weak, and that often means, in addition to the just practical difficulties, we want to have in our arsenal the idea that on strategic deterrence that we could use cyber-related tools to cause massive disruptions in an adversary. But when choosing how to respond, you'll see our financial system is still the envy of the world and dollar-based, and so we use sanctions. Or our legal system is an area where you look at our key adversaries, the Chinese, Russian, North Korean, Iranian legal systems are not credible. Here we still have a credible legal system, and so when it reaches a conclusion of attribution that someone has done something, it is credible and people act on it. And so you've seen us use that strength as well. So I think we should continue to look at that range of arsenal as what will cause the most pain, where are we strongest, where we can take action. And diplomatically, that means continuing to do the hard work of building, sometimes bilaterally, those relationships with other countries so they have parallel legal regimes and are willing to take joint action. And great successes like the one that Andy pointed to with our UK partners, I think, are an example of what can flow from that. Sorry, Matt, your other question was?
Yeah, just how the government's looking to evolve to be a better receiver of this type of information, especially with DOJ being at the ready to help act. How does that work with the regulatory regimes?
Unfortunately, there still is a bit of schizophrenia here. So you have the law enforcement intel agency very much now in a way that's, I don't think it's ever been to this extent, are victim friendly, want to help you as a private sector, and I bring clients in. I mean, to the point where, you know, a statement you don't hear from the FBI very often, the head of the cyber division said, my direction to my agents is I want them to be, quote, the Ritz-Carlton of customer service. Not, which he's not saying anymore. I'm sure other hotel chains were appalled that they were endorsing the Ritz-Carlton. But at the same time, you have the regulatory agencies taking an approach that's quite punitive to the victims. I think we need to continue to push as a policy matter, and some state AGs have said this explicitly, that they will not use information that you voluntarily, they will not ask for information that you voluntarily shared with FBI and intelligence. It doesn't get you a get out of regulatory jail free card, but it's not going to be used to cause harm or by the regulator. With the SEC, you have this explicit resolution that we reached with the Justice Department, where there's an opportunity for you to delay as a company disclosure to your investors what would otherwise be required within a very short period of time, a 72-hour period of time, if you have a stamp of approval essentially from the Justice Department that says it would cause public safety or national security harm. And I think that was designed to encourage cooperation. You do see statements from FTC, from Treasury Department's OFAC when it comes to sanctions, from SEC, where they have said that they will view it now as a positive if you have been working cooperatively with law enforcement or others, and inversely, if you have not, they will view that as a criteria when deciding to whether or not to take enforcement action. They will use that against you. So I think you do see some discussion about trying to calibrate the carrots and sticks to encourage you and make it easier to come forward.
Well, we're running up against the end of this session, so I'm just going to give everybody kind of some closing thoughts. Andy, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of riff off of what John was saying, I mean, I do think there's the regulatory part of it. I mean, every CISO discussion I'm part of, they're, you know, like, how are you ever going to hire CISOs if CISOs keep getting indicted and whatnot, just for, you know, theoretically doing their jobs? That's that part of the discussion. I do think we haven't really crossed the line yet on you know, bringing the non-cyber U.S. government community and the rest of the private sector into the discussion to understand the real nature of the nation state and non-nation state cyber threat. There's still a lot of people who sort of like, you know, it's Mars attacks. It's a bunch of aliens have come down and destroyed our networks or whatnot. No, they're actually human beings, usually in foreign countries, attacking infrastructure for nation state goals, be it intelligence collection or operational preparation of the battlefield. In the ransomware case, obviously making money, stealing money, but again, with the tacit approval frequently of our adversaries. These are all people. They're all adversaries, human adversaries. They're not from Mars. And until we get the rest of our fellow Americans and frankly, the non-cyber parts and the non-tech parts of the government get their head around that, we're still going to have a real struggle getting people to buy into this national security threat.
Candice, I saw you nodding along, and I think you're pretty much in agreement there.
I absolutely agree. And I tell people you shouldn't be afraid just because you don't have a computer science degree or a technical background to try and understand it. Amazingly and miraculously, we had so many people become counterterrorism and terrorist experts overnight after September 11th. So why don't we have this? I think people are very intimidated by the technical field, and sometimes it's not a very welcoming field because you don't have 50,000 certifications. But if you understand the part that this plays in national security, it is a great field to get into. And that's why I continue to encourage others to lean into this, because protecting our economy is a key part of this, and this is how it helps. This is our economic future is a part of national security, as so is our critical infrastructure backbone, and cyber's one big piece of that. So I can't just nod heartily enough to what was just stated. This is cybersecurity is national security.
All right, John, I'll let you close us out.
I can't do better than that. That's a great note to end on.
All right, and welcome back, Suzanne.
Very succinct for an attorney. I love that, John. Really fantastic conversation. I want to thank all of you. I mean, you've given me so many threads here to follow up on in the future cyber initiatives group, sort of online and in our future summit. So a lot of deep thinking here. Thank you so much, Andy Boyd, Candice Frost, and John Carlin, all principal members. If you'd like to check out their bios, cyberinitiativesgroup.com, you'll find them on the principal list there. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.